Okay, guys, so after looking at this video that I made, I realized that I actually made an error. So let's fix that first. So this was 3x plus 1, so this should have been a plus. So that means if you move the plus 1 over there, then this becomes minus 1. So this is actually, let me erase the whole thing. It has to be minus 1 over 3. Okay. Um, I've also noticed that my earphones are still not that great. Like my microphone, I think the sound isn't that great even today. So maybe I'm gonna use a different microphone. I'm not too sure. But maybe there's another one that I have at home. Maybe those ones might be a little better. So moving forward, I'll try that out. Um, And I was just looking at the video. I think it's a little bit messy. So maybe I'm gonna clear up the mess. So again, so this is this is like the third time that I'm actually recording myself. Maybe not the third time, but the third time that you will see me record myself because the other two crashed. So that was unfortunate. Anyway, so moving on. Question this question. Okay, so here again, you should not be using product sum because you don't have three terms. Okay, product sum only works when you have a x squared plus bx plus c. This is a sophisticated technique, okay, that you only have to use when you don't really have an option. Okay, so over here, there's actually a much faster way to answer this question. There's actually two ways. Now, because you only see one x, right, you can easily isolate for that. So if I move the 49, negative 49 over there, this becomes x squared is equals to 49, okay? And then what you can do is you can just take the square root of x squared and then square root of 49. But when you take the square root, you always have to put the plus and minus, okay? When you have x squared equals to something, when you take the square root of that, you always have to put the plus and minus, okay? So that means that x is equals to plus and minus 7 because remember quadratic functions have two um, roots, right, in most cases, so that's why you have to consider the negative 7 as well. Now another way of doing this question is to simply um, use difference of squares. So let's do this here. So whenever you have two terms, guys, separated by a minus sign, okay, and both of them are square numbers, then you have to use difference of squares. Okay, even if they're not square terms, then you'll probably have to factor something first and then use difference of squares. So in other words, whenever you see two terms separated by a minus sign, then use difference of squares. Okay. So if I use difference of squares, I have to look at the term on the left side of my minus sign, which is x squared. So open the brackets, take the square root of whatever is on the left hand side. So square root of x squared is just x. And then you have to take the square root of what is on the right hand side of the equation, which is 49. So square root of 49 is 7. Okay. Now rewrite the same thing, okay, with a minus sign. So most of you did this on the test, but you forgot to, let me make this look a little nicer. So let's put the minus sign in between. I'm actually also going to buy a new um, iPad pencil. I don't really like this one. So this was a cheap one that came with a tablet that my dad bought. So it's not the best one. So I'm gonna go to Best Buy maybe after school and buy something that will make my handwriting look a little neater. Okay. So on the test, most of you did this, right? So take the square root, but then you have to rewrite the same thing with a minus sign. This is what you did not do. So you got half the mark, right? Now remember, because we're solving, right, this is equals to 0. So we can consider this as A and this is B. right? So either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0. So that means either x plus 7 is equals to 0, which means that if I solve for x, then x is equals to minus 7, or x minus 7 is equal to 0. So if I solve for x, I get x is equal to 7, okay? So there's two answers. Either x has to be minus 7 or x has to be 7, which is essentially what I have over here. But I think this was way faster, right? So when you see one x only, then isolate for that and then just take the square root, okay? So when you only see one x, it's really easy to solve. Now here, again, it's not a trinomial, okay? This is not the same as that because here your c value is 0. So this is actually easier to solve. Again, first thing you have to do is make it equal to 0. So let's move the 30 over to this side. It doesn't matter what you move over, right? You could have moved the 5x over there. Either way it will work. So just make it equals to 0. 5x squared minus 30x is equals to 0. Okay, now because you only have two terms, you don't have to use product sum. You can just factor, okay? So again, there's many ways of doing this. What I would do is I'm going to look for the biggest number that divides 5 and 30, so that's 5. And then I have an x here, x squared actually, and then an x there, so the x is repeating itself, right? So I'm also going to have to factor in x, and then open the brackets, and then ask yourself this question. What do you need to multiply this 5x by to get this 5x squared? And the answer is just x, okay, because 5 is already there. And what do you need to multiply this 5x by again to get negative 30x? And that's just minus 6, okay? Now, again, you have a product of two terms. This is the first term, this is the second term equals to 0, so you can consider this to be your A and this as your B. So either A is 0 or B is 0. That means either 5x is equals to 0. So when you solve for x, you have to divide by 5, divide by 5. So x is equals to 0, or x minus 6 is equal to 0. So that means x is equal to 6, okay? And you can always check your work, right? So if you plug in 0 here, 5 times 0 squared is 0, and 30 times 0 is 0, right? And if you plug this 6 back here, you'll see that both your right and left hand side will be the same. So 30 times 6 is 180, and 5 times 6 squared, so 6 squared is 36, and 36 times 5 is also 180. So both of these values will satisfy your equation. You don't have to rely on product sum for this because product sum technique only works when you have all three terms, okay? So when you have A, B, and C, then you have to rely on product sum, which is a sophisticated technique. Now, if you have two terms, right? Here, your B value is equals to 0, right? So your B value is equals to 0. So you can isolate for x very easily and then solve for your roots, kind of like what I did over here. Okay, that's the best way of doing it. Here, maybe let me use a different color. Here, actually, your C value is equals to 0. So when your C value is equals to 0, then you can just use simple factoring, okay? You don't have to do product sum. So I factored 5x over here, and then I used the fact that if A times B is equal to 0, then either A has to equal to 0 or B has to equal to 0, okay? So these ones were a lot simpler, a lot more simple to solve. Okay, so now let me just open up the test questions. So there were a couple of test questions that actually gave you a hard time. So I'm gonna revisit those questions. So the first one that you struggled with, most of you did, was this one, x plus 1 bracket squared over 4 minus 49. Okay, so again, guys, okay, when someone asks you to factor a question like this, as soon as you see a minus sign, it has to be difference of squares, okay? And luckily for you, both 49 and this term over here are nice, perfect squares, so you can easily take the square root of those, okay? So this is an indication that this has to be a difference of squares. So how do you apply difference of squares? Well, you focus on the term that is on the left-hand side of your minus sign, okay? And you take the square root of that. So square root of x plus 1 squared is just x plus 1. So you have to take the square root of, essentially, take the square root of your numerator and denominator separately, okay? So I'm just going to remove that square root. So square root of x plus 1 squared is just x plus 1, and then square root of 4 is just 2. Then you take the square root of whatever is on the right-hand side of your minus sign, okay? So this guy. So put a plus sign. So square root of 49 is 7, right? And most of you got this, but then remember, this is half the answer because then you have to essentially rewrite the same thing, okay, with a minus sign. Okay, that's how you do difference of squares, okay? So this wasn't a difficult question if you knew that you had to do difference of squares right from the get-go, right? So how do you know it's a difference of squares? Well, whenever you have two terms, 1, 2, separated by a minus sign, it has to be difference of squares. Okay, that kind of gives it away. Okay. The second question that wasn't well done was this one. So you had let me use the red. I really like the red color for some reason, so I'm just gonna continue using that one. So it's 2x plus 1 squared minus 2x plus 1 minus 10. So you had to factor this. Again, you're not solving because it's not equals to 0 or something, okay? So there's no equal sign, so all you have to do is just factor. Now, this kind of looks like a quadratic because you have 2x plus 1 here, 2x plus 1 there, so it's kind of like repeating itself. There's more than one way to do this question. One way would be to expand this. So, expand this, you'll get 4x squared plus 4x plus 1, and then distribute the 3 over, and then simplify, and then combine your like terms and simplify that quadratic, but that's just too long. The best way of doing a question like this, and I showed this to you in my notes, is to make this look a little nicer. So because we have 2x plus 1 and 2x plus 1 repeating itself, I'm just going to substitute that with a variable that I'm not already using. So you could use y. I like to use m because sometimes y is also being used. So I'm going to let m equals to 2x plus 1 and make this look a lot nicer. So I'm going to replace this by m, so this becomes m squared minus 3m minus 10. Now I'm going to factor this quadratic equation, and it's going to be fairly straightforward because my coefficient here is 1, so I can actually use the shortcut. Okay, so I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 1 times negative 10, so that's negative 10, and add up to minus 3. Okay, so they have to add up to minus 3. Okay, so what is the combination? Again, if you're not very good at finding the combination, just try 1 and 10. That's not going to work. And then go to 2, okay? And then 3 and then 4 and so forth. So on and so forth. But for 2, it will actually work because 2 times 5 gives you 10. Now, because this number is negative, that means my bigger number has to be negative, right? So 2 times negative 5 is negative 10, and 2 minus 5 is actually negative 3, right? And once you have the combination, right, because your coefficient is 1, you can just write the variable, which is m, and then whatever your first number is, so that's plus 2, close the brackets, open the bracket, m again, and then minus 5, okay? Now, that's how you use the shortcut, right? You're just writing the variable, and then the first number, and then your variable again with the second number. You could also rewrite minus 3m in an intelligent way, so that would be 2m, right? Minus 5m, and then do grouping. But that's just, I mean, it will work, but it's time consuming, okay? So some of you stopped over here, and I gave you some marks for that because um, I think it was out of 2, so I gave you maybe 1 mark because this is not the final answer, okay? Remember, m is actually 2x plus 1. So now you have to back substitute that value in this equation. So this will become, I'm going to replace m by 2x plus 1. You could put that in brackets. In this case, it doesn't matter because you're not multiplying it. So the brackets will not help you avoid any silly mistakes. It's always a great idea to use the brackets, okay? Because sometimes you might have a coefficient, and then you'll have to distribute. You'll have to distribute to each term separately. In this case, it doesn't matter, okay? So some of you left this as your final answer, and I gave you full marks for that. However, you can simplify this a step further, okay? So the plus 1 and the plus 2 will combine, so this becomes 2x plus 3. And the plus 1 and the minus 5 will combine, so it just becomes 2x minus 4. This would be the final answer, okay? So again, guys, it's a little messy. So if you looked at the notes only, it might be a little messy, but as I'm doing the notes, I'm like kind of like touching my screen to show you where exactly I'm looking at. That's why it gets a little bit messy. So please watch the whole video. You can, if I'm going a bit too fast, you can always pause the video, rewind. But if I'm going a bit too slow and you know all this stuff, then you can just fast forward, right? The only issue with fast forwarding is that my notes will look a little messy when you do that, okay? So hopefully you can follow along if you're doing that. And yeah, so this is it. I also gave my grade 10s a quiz on factoring. Those guys are doing really well. So because I spent more time on factoring with them, right? Because they actually they're seeing this for the first time. So I'm gonna upload their quiz video to Google Classroom, to their Google Classroom, but I'm also gonna send that to you guys. So for those of you who need more practice, I can actually um, post that as well, okay? Okay, thank you.